It was the summer of 1881, the age of discovery. The United States wanted to prove it could stand among the great nations of exploration, and so they launched an ambitious Arctic mission under a man named Lieutenant Adolphus Greely, a soldier, not a sailor, but known for discipline and courage. His task? To build the northernmost weather station in human history and collect scientific data for the world's first international polar year. 25 men boarded the ship Proteus, full of pride and confidence. These weren't seasoned explorers, they were young soldiers, engineers, and a handful of scientists, each driven by the dream of glory. The plan was simple: sail to the far north of Greenland, build a base at a place called Lady Franklin Bay, spend 2 years there, and wait for the resupply ship to bring them home. The Arctic was cruel from the beginning. Ice formed thick around the hull, winds screamed through the rigging, and daylight began shrinking by the hour. But when they reached their destination, they worked with relentless determination. They built Fort Conger, a cluster of wooden huts buried in snow and surrounded by mountains of ice. Inside, they raised the American flag and cheered. The youngest member, just 19, wrote in his diary, "We are farther north than any American has ever lived. We are pioneers at the edge of the world." For a time, it felt almost peaceful. The men hunted muskoxen, studied the weather, and even broke a world record when one of Greely's sergeants, James Lockwood, tracked farther north than any human had gone before. They laughed, celebrated birthdays, and believed rescue was just months away. But in the Arctic, hope melts faster than ice under the wrong sun. When their ship Proteus tried to return the next year with new supplies, it hit an unbreakable wall of sea ice. The crew had no choice but to turn back. Greely and his men never received the message. They waded through another dark winter, surviving on rations and dreams. The polar night, 6 months of total darkness, weighed heavy on their minds. Some men grew restless, others withdrew in silence, staring into the blackness for hours. But Greely kept order. He was a strict leader, fair but hard. He reminded them, discipline is our only hope. Then came the second blow. In 1883, the Proteus tried again and was crushed by ice. Sunk, gone forever. The men of the Greely expedition were now completely cut off, thousands of miles from civilization, trapped in the world's most unforgiving wilderness with no ship and dwindling food. They didn't know it yet, but their real test, the test of survival, had only just begun. By August 1883, Greely made the hardest decision of his life: abandon Fort Conger and move south in search of rescue. He believed supply caches had been left along the coast. If they could reach them, they might live. If not, well, staying meant certain death. The men packed what little they had: tents, sledges, notebooks, and rations. They loaded small boats onto the ice, and when cracks opened in the floes, they paddled through freezing channels of water, dragging their gear behind them. Imagine that, pulling half a ton of supplies over sharp, uneven ice, while snowstorms blinded your path and polar bears stalked the edges of your camp. For weeks, they struggled southward. They were starving, frostbitten, and weak, but they refused to stop. One man fell through the ice, gone instantly beneath the black water. Another lost his toes to frostbite. Greely kept his men moving with military precision, shouting commands even as his own beard froze to his coat. Finally, they reached Cape Sabine,
a desolate stretch of rock and snow, surrounded by sea ice and howling wind. It wasn't salvation, it was a graveyard. They built what they called Camp Clay, just a few torn tents and a wrecked boat turned upside down for shelter. Their rations were nearly gone, and the emergency supply cache they'd hoped to find contained barely enough to last 2 months. The men stared at the meager pile of food in silence. One whispered, "This is all?" Another muttered, "We're done for." Then came winter. Endless, black, howling winter. Food ran out fast. They began eating boiled leather, candle wax, and tiny scraps of frozen seal meat they found buried under snow. Some nights the wind was so strong it ripped tents apart. Frostbite took fingers, noses, ears. Morale broke. Discipline cracked. Greely kept writing in his journal, daily reports of temperatures, weather, and deaths. He refused to let madness win. Men began dying, one by one. First from hunger, then from exhaustion, then from despair. The snow around camp became a frozen graveyard, shallow mounds of ice marked by crude wooden sticks. By spring, only a handful were left alive. Greely himself could barely stand. His once proud uniform hung off him like rags. He stared at his surviving men, hollow eyes, pale faces, bones pressing against skin. The world had abandoned them. No rescue, no hope. And then, rumors began, whispered at night. Some said they'd seen strange things, meat disappearing from the dead, bones stripped clean. Greely refused to believe it, but deep down he knew the men were doing whatever they had to do to survive. Cannibalism, the unspoken horror of every Arctic expedition, had arrived.
By June of 1884, Greely and 6 men remained alive. They were skeletons in uniforms, barely breathing, too weak to walk, surviving on nothing but bits of shrimp and melted ice. The rest of their crew, 20 men, lay frozen around the camp. And then, one morning, a faint sound broke the silence, the crack of a gunshot echoing through the wind. At first, they thought it was a hallucination. But then came voices, real voices. The rescue ship Thetis had arrived, sent by the U.S. Navy after years of failed attempts. The rescuers found a nightmare. The tents were torn, the camp half buried in snow. Dead bodies lay stacked near the rocks. Greely was barely conscious, his lips blue, his hands raw. He looked up at the rescuers and whispered, "You've come at last." Out of 25 men, only 6 survived, including Greely. When they returned home, they were hailed as heroes at first, survivors of impossible odds. But then, whispers began. The rescuers' reports spoke of missing flesh, cut bones, unmistakable signs of cannibalism. Newspapers exploded with scandal. Some called them brave, others called them monsters. Greely never denied it, but he never confirmed it either. He simply said, "We did what we had to do." No man who lived through that winter should be judged by those who have never known such hunger. Despite the controversy, Greely's team's work was invaluable. Their records,
thousands of pages of weather data, temperature readings, and Arctic maps became the foundation of modern polar science. They had gone to the edge of the world and brought knowledge back from hell itself. Years later, when Greely was asked what he remembered most, he didn't talk about the data or the medals. He spoke of the faces of his men, laughing around a fire, joking on the deck of the Proteus before the ice took them all. He said, "It was not science that kept us alive. It was the hope of seeing home again." And that's the haunting truth of the Greely expedition, a story of courage, madness, and survival in the coldest place on Earth. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in the Arctic isn't the ice, it's the human heart when it's pushed too far.